They say time heals all wounds. In America, it just sharpens daggers. 17 years ago, my father threw me into a blizzard to take the fall for his golden boy, assuming a penniless 18-year-old would drown, but the dark taught me to hunt. Today, at my grandmother's funeral, he smirks at my presumed failure. He has no idea the man walking through those doors is my husband, bringing the death sentence for his entire empire. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment. My name is Mackenzie Alvarado. The mahogany doors of my father's study always felt like the gates of hell. Heavy and suffocating. I was 18 years old, standing on the center of his imported Persian rug, shivering not from the brutal Massachusetts winter raging outside the frosted window panes, but from the bone-chilling reality of what was sitting on his massive desk. Carlos Alvarado, the untouchable real estate titan of Silverbridge, sat in his high-backed leather chair. He did not look at me like a father looks at a daughter. He looked at me the way an accountant looks at a write-off. Beside him stood Leo, my older half-brother. Leo was the golden child, the heir apparent, the one who carried the Alvarado name with the reckless arrogance of a prince who knew he would never have to pay for his own sins. And there were many sins. For months, whispers of a colossal tax evasion and embezzlement scandal had haunted the halls of our mansion. Millions of dollars had vanished from the company accounts, funneled into shell corporations and offshore black holes. Everyone in that room knew exactly whose fingerprints were on those transfers. It was Leo. He had gambled with the family empire to fund his lavish lifestyle and catastrophic investments. But Carlos could never let his precious heir go down. The Alvarado legacy required a king, not a convict. So, the king needed a sacrificial lamb. "Sign the paper, Mackenzie," my father ordered, his voice smooth, devoid of any paternal warmth. He pushed a thick manila folder across the polished oak surface. Inside was a meticulously drafted confession. It detailed a complex web of financial fraud, all neatly pinned on the 18-year-old girl who barely had access to her own trust fund, let alone the corporate treasury. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. I stared at the black ink, my vision blurring with a mixture of disbelief and raw, burning rage. "No," the word slipped from my lips, quiet but resolute. Carlos paused, his hand hovering over his crystal tumbler of scotch. The air in the room grew dangerously thin. "What did you say?" "I said no," I repeated, lifting my chin, forcing my trembling legs to stand firm. "I did not steal those millions of dollars. Leo did. You know he did. I will not go to federal prison for his crimes." Leo shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit, offering a pathetic, mocking smirk from the shadows. "Come on, Mac. You are young. You will get a reduced sentence. Dad has the best lawyers. You will be out in 5 years. Tops." "Shut up, Leo!" I snapped, turning my fierce glare back to my father. "I am not signing away my life to save your useless son." The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos stood up slowly. The veins in his neck bulged, a silent testament to his mounting fury. He hated defiance. He demanded absolute submission. Without warning, he grabbed the heavy crystal tumbler and hurled it violently across the room. It shattered against the stone fireplace, raining sharp, glittering shards across the hearth. "You ungrateful little brat!" he roared, slamming his fists down on the desk. "I gave you a roof over your head. I gave you a name. You are nothing without me. You will sign this paper, or you will cease to exist in this family." "Then I guess I am an orphan," I fired back, my voice steady despite the hurricane of panic ripping through my chest. Carlos stepped around the desk, his towering figure casting a long, dark shadow over me. His eyes were cold, dead pools of obsidian. "Get out." "Dad," I started, a momentary flicker of a daughter's vulnerability breaking through. "I said get out," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the vast manor. "Pack whatever fits in one bag. You have 10 minutes. You leave your credit cards, your phone, your keys. You take absolutely nothing that I paid for. I want you out of my house tonight." I did not argue. Arguing with a tyrant was a fool's errand. I turned on my heel and marched out of the study. I sprinted up the grand sweeping staircase to my room. Grabbing an old canvas duffel bag, I threw in 2 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, some underwear, and the single photograph of my late mother I possessed. As I descended the stairs for the final time, I saw her. Grandmother Elena stood on the landing, clutching the mahogany railing. Her frail body trembled, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. She was the matriarch, but she was entirely dependent on Carlos's wealth. She looked at me with a profound, agonizing helplessness. She could not stop the storm, but her eyes held a silent apology. I gave her a microscopic nod, a silent promise that I understood. Carlos was waiting by the massive iron front doors. He had swung them wide open, inviting the howling blizzard into the marble foyer. The wind whipped snow violently onto the floor. I walked toward the threshold, the bitter cold instantly biting through my thin coat. I stepped onto the frozen porch. Before I could turn away, Carlos leaned against the doorframe. He crossed his arms and offered me a smile so cruel it could have frozen hell over. "Let us see how many days your cheap pride keeps you alive in this country," he sneered, the mockery dripping from every syllable. The heavy doors slammed shut behind me with a thunderous boom, echoing the finality of a judge's gavel. The lock clicked. I was entirely alone in the blinding white fury of a midnight storm, without a single dollar to my name. I gripped the handles of my duffel bag until my knuckles turned white. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury for those who had a safety net. I walked down the long, winding driveway, the snow crunching heavily under my boots. When I reached the imposing wrought iron gates, I stopped and looked back. The Alvarado mansion stood proudly in the distance, every window blazing with warm, golden light against the black sky. I stared at the empire that had just exiled me. I committed every brick, every window, every shadowed archway to memory. The cold was seeping into my bones, but a different kind of fire ignited deep within my chest. "Enjoy your warmth, Carlos," I whispered to the roaring wind, "because when I come back, I am buying this entire estate, and I am going to tear it down." The first 5 years were a brutal, unending masterclass in starvation and sheer, unadulterated willpower. Surviving on the streets of a frozen city was not poetic. It was ugly, exhausting, and entirely stripped of dignity. I worked 3 separate jobs just to maintain a rotting roof over my head in a forgotten corner of South Boston. My mornings began at 4 o'clock. Scrubbing grease off the grills of a 24-hour diner where the patrons treated me like invisible dirt. By noon, I was hauling heavy boxes in a suffocating warehouse, and when the sun went down, I caught a crosstown bus to the financial district, pushing a heavy mop bucket across the pristine marble floors of corporate law firms. I cleaned the very offices belonging to men who wore the same arrogant cologne as my father. I watched the dawn break through panoramic glass windows while scrubbing executive toilets. My hands cracked, blistered, and bleeding, my stomach a hollow cavern of hunger. I counted pennies. I lived on 99-cent ramen noodles and tap water for months on end. The cold seeped into my bones, a constant, aching reminder of the night I was thrown away. But I was not completely abandoned to the wolves. Every 3 or 4 months, an unmarked, battered manila envelope would arrive at my rundown apartment complex. There was never a return address. Inside, neatly folded, there would always be $200 or $300 in crisp, untraceable bills. Wrapped around the cash was a single, small square of heavy cardstock stationery that always smelled faintly of dry lavender. It was my grandmother, Elena. She never signed her name. She never wrote to ask how I was doing. Knowing perfectly well that any correspondence could be intercepted by my father, the note only ever contained one single, fiercely penned sentence: "Wolves do not cry, wolves hunt." That money was my absolute lifeline. It kept the heating radiators hissing during the deadly January freezes. It bought me a bulky, second-hand laptop from a pawn shop, a machine that hummed loudly like a dying engine but still possessed a functional processor. That broken machine became my weapon of mass destruction, while the rest of the city slept, while my muscles screamed in agony from 18 hours of manual labor. I sat on the bare floorboards and coded. I possessed a mind that saw structural patterns in absolute chaos, a genius for encryption and digital architecture that Carlos had never cared to notice because I was not his precious son. From my freezing, 50-square-foot bedroom, wrapped in 2 moth-eaten thrift store blankets, I began building a data security matrix unlike anything currently existing on the market. It was an autonomous, adaptive, unbreakable digital fortress. I designed it to ruthlessly protect the very digital assets and corporate secrets that men like my father believed were untouchable. I called the protocol Nexus. The development process was agonizing. I worked for 48 hours straight sometimes, surviving on black coffee and spite. When the core algorithm finally stabilized on my 22nd birthday, I knew I had created a monster. I formally registered Nexus Core Analytics the very next morning. At first, we were nothing but anonymous whispers in the dark corners of underground tech forums. I took on freelance security contracts, systematically tearing apart the firewalls of massive corporations just to show them how weak they were, and then charging them heavily to fix the vulnerabilities I had just exposed. Within 2 years, those underground whispers turned into deafening, unavoidable roars across the global tech industry. Nexus Core evolved from a one-woman operation in a slum into a cybersecurity monolith. We moved headquarters to the West Coast, securing massive, multi-year contracts with defense contractors, international intelligence agencies, and global banking conglomerates. I was no longer the freezing, terrified girl crying on a porch. I was a phantom chief executive officer, a woman entirely devoid of mercy, exacting and absolute in my demands. That was when I inevitably caught the predatory attention of the Silicon Valley venture capital titans. They wanted to buy me out, swallow my revolutionary technology whole, and slap their corporate logo over my life's work. One particular firm sent their apex predator to handle the hostile acquisition. His name was Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel was a living legend in the venture capital sector, a man notoriously known for gutting legacy companies and leaving entire boards of directors bleeding metaphorically on the boardroom floor. He walked into my San Francisco executive office wearing a bespoke suit that projected an aura of dangerous, quiet power. He did not posture, he did not boast. He simply sat across from my desk, his dark eyes incredibly sharp and intensely evaluating, tracking me like a hawk calculating the exact fatal angle of a dive. "I am authorized to offer $50 million for the total acquisition of Nexus Core," he stated smoothly, his voice a low, commanding baritone as he slid a bound term sheet across my sleek glass desk. "It is a highly generous valuation. Miss Alvarado, sign it, take the capital, and you will never have to fight for a single thing another day in your life." I did not even break eye contact to look at the document. I stared directly into the abyss of his eyes and leaned forward. "Nexus Core is not for sale. Mr. Cross, not for $50 million, not for $500 million. Your entire structural analysis of my company is fundamentally flawed. You are valuing my current projected revenue, not my underlying infrastructure. In exactly 36 months, your own portfolio companies will be paying me 10 times your generous offer just to keep their servers from completely collapsing under foreign cyber assaults. So, you can take your term sheet, walk out of my building, or you can sit back down, shut your mouth, and ask me how you can secure the privilege of investing on my specific terms." He stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The arrogant, predatory smirk on his handsome face completely vanished, instantly replaced by something infinitely more dangerous, absolute, intoxicating fascination. He slowly sat back down in the leather chair. We spent the next 14 hours locked inside that soundproof office, viciously tearing apart each other's financial models, negotiating with the brutal ruthlessness of armed gladiators. He was brilliantly analytical. He was utterly merciless. And for the very first time in my entire grueling existence, I realized I had finally met my absolute equal. We did not merely become business partners when the sun rose the next morning. We recognized the exact same darkness, the exact same relentless, insatiable hunger lingering in each other's souls. Nathaniel and I were two apex predators who had been circling the same bloody territory, and instead of tearing each other's throats out, we realized we could systematically conquer the entire global ecosystem together. Our corporate partnership inevitably and fiercely bled from the boardroom into our personal lives. We were married 2 years later in a heavily guarded, fiercely private ceremony on a remote cliffside on the Amalfi Coast. There were no white doves released, no flowery fairy tale vows spoken. It was just two titans standing together, quietly swearing a lifelong oath of unwavering loyalty to one another and promising absolute devastation to anyone who dared to stand in our path. Together, we built an unstoppable financial and technological empire that utterly dwarfed anything my pathetic father could have ever dreamed of building. And I waited. I sharpened my claws every single day for 17 long years, quietly watching the Alvarado Empire begin to rot and crumble from the inside out, patiently preparing for the inevitable day the exiled wolf would finally return home to hunt. 17 years. That was how long it had been since I last breathed the bitter air of Silverbridge. I was 35 years old now, standing in the center of my glass-enclosed executive suite on the 80th floor of the Nexus Core Tower. The sprawling skyline of San Francisco stretched out endlessly beneath me, a glittering grid of light and power that I commanded. The room was perfectly silent, insulated from the chaos of the world below, until the secure line on my desk chimed. It was a restricted number. I answered it, expecting a diplomatic envoy or a defense secretary. Instead, a trembling, reedy voice spoke. It was my younger cousin, Beatrice. "Mackenzie, it is Grandma Elena. She passed away this morning." The world simply stopped rotating. The floor beneath my designer heels felt as though it had vanished, leaving me suspended in a breathless, suffocating vacuum. The skyline blurred. My grandmother was gone. The only thread of humanity that had ever existed within the toxic, sprawling web of the Alvarado dynasty had been violently severed. She was the woman who had kept me from freezing to death with her secret envelopes and fierce, silent defiance. Now, she was just a memory, and a heavy, crushing grief settled directly into my chest, anchoring me to the floor. I hung up the phone and immediately dialed the only person who could steady the sudden earthquake in my soul. Nathaniel picked up on the first ring. Despite the fact that it was 2 o'clock in the morning in London, he was right in the middle of a vicious, emergency board meeting for a massive European conglomerate acquisition. I told him the news. His tone instantly shifted from corporate conqueror to fiercely protective husband. "I am leaving right now," Nathaniel declared, his voice a steady, immovable bedrock. "I am pulling the team out of the boardroom and having the pilots fuel the jet. I will be by your side before they even put her in the ground. My love, do not face those vultures alone for long." "I will be fine," I whispered, though my voice shook slightly. "Just get here safely." I packed a single, unassuming overnight bag and flew commercial under an alias to the East Coast, slipping through the shadows just as I had learned to do all those years ago. When I landed in Massachusetts, I bypassed the private chauffeur services and deliberately rented a dull mid-size gray sedan. I wanted zero attention. I needed to slide perfectly into the pathetic, broken narrative that my father and my brother had undoubtedly spun about my tragic, failed life. The drive back into Silverbridge felt like navigating through a cursed graveyard. The towering pines and wrought iron fences looked exactly the same, monuments to old money and older sins. I parked the cheap rental car down the block from the grand, impossibly lavish funeral parlor that catered exclusively to the city elite. The parking lot was a sea of polished black luxury vehicles, a sickening display of wealth even in the face of death. I stepped out into the biting autumn air. I wore a perfectly tailored but completely unbranded, austere black dress, no jewelry, no aggressive styling, just a ghost returning to the scene of her murder. The moment I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the viewing hall, the ambient hum of polite, aristocratic murmuring abruptly died. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the expansive room. Dozens of heads turned in unison. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and old family associates stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I could practically hear the cruel gears turning in their heads. They looked at my simple dress, my solitary arrival, and the lack of a diamond on my hand, as I had specifically removed my wedding ring for this very moment. They saw exactly what they desperately wanted to see: a failure, a wretched, impoverished woman who had crawled back from the gutter to beg for scraps at the matriarch's wake. I felt their disdainful, mocking gazes clawing at my skin, but my posture remained violently straight, my expression carved from pure Arctic ice. I did not offer a single greeting. I did not acknowledge a single gasp. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted as I walked straight down the center aisle, my heels clicking methodically against the marble floor like the ticking of a doomsday clock. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the polished mahogany casket resting at the front of the hall, ignoring the wolves pacing in the periphery. I was not there for them, not yet. I reached the casket and looked down at the pale, peaceful face of the woman who had quietly saved my life. I placed my hand gently over hers, letting the overwhelming silence of the approaching storm wash over me. The solemn service eventually bled into a stiff, suffocating reception in the adjoining parlor. I remained anchored near the heavily draped windows, sipping lukewarm water, watching the predatory ecosystem of my estranged family operate. It did not take long for the apex predator of this decaying jungle to locate me. Carlos Alvarado broke through the throng of whispering socialites and approached my corner. He tried to project the same towering, unyielding authority he had wielded 17 years ago, but the facade was crumbling violently. His bespoke tailored suit hung slightly loose on his frame, as if he had recently lost a significant amount of weight from sheer stress. The skin around his eyes was deeply lined with a frantic, sleepless exhaustion. I knew exactly why he looked like a cornered, desperate animal. For the past 6 months, an aggressive, completely anonymous shadow corporation had been systematically buying up every single one of his heavily leveraged debts, pushing his once mighty real estate empire to the absolute brink of total, unrecoverable insolvency. He was a king standing on a trapdoor, and he did not even realize my hand was resting firmly on the lever. But Carlos, ever the toxic narcissist, desperately needed someone to look down upon to soothe his own bleeding, fragile ego. His cold, dark eyes swept over me, taking a vicious, calculating inventory of my appearance. He immediately noted the complete absence of expensive designer logos on my plain black dress. He looked at my bare hands, devoid of the massive, ostentatious diamonds that the women of our social circle always flaunted. He had undoubtedly been informed by his vast security detail that I had arrived completely alone, driving a cheap, unremarkable domestic rental car. In his narrow, severely materialistic universe, these specific clues painted a very obvious picture. He saw a broken, destitute woman who had been thoroughly crushed by the unforgiving reality of the world. A slow, immensely satisfied smirk crawled across his face. It was the exact same cruel, twisted smile he had worn that freezing night in the blizzard when he locked me out. "Looks like life finally punished you," Carlos sneered, his voice a low, gravelly purr designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. I did not flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, letting the heavy silence stretch just long enough to make him internally uncomfortable, though his massive ego masked it well. "You thought you were so incredibly brave, walking out of my house with nothing but a trash bag," he continued, taking an aggressive step closer, actively invading my personal space. He intentionally raised his volume, ensuring the nearby aunts, uncles, and wealthy business associates could hear every single humiliating syllable. The ambient chatter in the grand room began to die down rapidly as the family vultures sensed fresh blood. You threw away your glorious legacy for what exactly a pathetic, miserable existence. Look at you. You look like a wretched charity case who wandered in from the freezing street to steal a free meal from her betters. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering crowd of elite hypocrites. I saw my half-brother, Leo, standing a few feet behind Carlos. The supposed golden boy had aged terribly. His face was puffy from years of heavy drinking, unchecked indulgence, and the secret stress of running his father's failing projects into the ground. But he still possessed that same highly punchable, arrogant sneer. Leo crossed his arms over his chest, leaning heavily against a marble pillar, looking utterly triumphant and thoroughly disgusted by my mere presence. "This is the inevitable, devastating consequence of daring to defy your own blood," Carlos boomed, playing theatrically to his captive audience. He was clearly relishing this moment. It was a desperate, pathetic power trip for a man who was secretly losing every other aspect of control in his miserable life. You stubbornly refused to protect your family, and now look exactly where it got you. Nowhere. You are absolutely nothing, and you have absolutely nothing. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and slowly, mockingly, pulled out a sleek designer leather wallet. He extracted a crisp $50 bill and held it out toward me, pinching it between his index and middle fingers exactly like he was offering a rotting scrap of meat to a starving, diseased stray dog. "Do you need a few pennies to pay for your miserable cab ride back to the airport?" Carlos asked, his tone dripping with thick, acidic pity. "Or are you perhaps planning on begging me on your knees to let you sleep in the servant quarters tonight? Because let me assure you right now, my doors are permanently closed to ungrateful, useless failures." The surrounding relatives exchanged knowing, vicious glances. Several of the older aunts actually chuckled behind their manicured hands. They were eagerly waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the humiliated tears, the screaming, the desperate, groveling apologies of a completely defeated exile. They desperately wanted me to shatter on the polished marble floor so they could sweep up the broken pieces and feel incredibly superior about their own hollow lives. But the raging fire that Carlos had intentionally ignited in my chest 17 years ago had not burned me to useless ash. It had systematically forged me into something entirely unbreakable. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at him. Instead, a genuine, terrifyingly serene smile slowly blossomed on my face. I completely ignored the crumpled money fluttering in his outstretched hand. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my left wrist and glanced casually at the face of my watch. The timing was absolutely, mathematically perfect. I looked back up, meeting my father's cruel, expecting gaze with the calm, detached precision of an executioner about to pull the trapdoor lever. "Actually, Father," I replied, my voice incredibly smooth, dangerously quiet, and carrying a lethal, unseen weight that instantly froze the arrogant smirk right on his aging face. "I want to introduce you to my husband." Carlos opened his mouth, a harsh, booming laugh already rumbling deep within his chest at the sheer absurdity of my statement. He genuinely thought I was inventing a phantom savior to salvage my shredded dignity. He was fully prepared to deliver the final, crushing verbal blow to completely shatter me in front of the entire family. But that mocking sound never materialized. Before a single syllable of laughter could escape his lips, the massive, heavy oak doors at the far end of the parlor did not just open, they were violently thrust apart. 4 men stepped through the threshold in perfect, synchronized unison. They were built like armored tanks, dressed in immaculate midnight black suits, their eyes scanning the room with the lethal, mechanical efficiency of a specialized security detail sweeping a hostile zone. They immediately moved to the perimeter, securing the exits, their mere presence dropping the room's temperature by another 10 degrees. Behind them marched a phalanx of 7 sharp-eyed men and women carrying sleek leather briefcases. They were unmistakable. They radiated the specific, predatory arrogance of elite Wall Street corporate litigators. And finally, parting the sea of terrifying lawyers like a dark god descending upon a gathering of mere mortals, came Nathaniel Cross. The collective gasp that echoed through the grand parlor was so sharp it sounded like the air itself had shattered. Total, suffocating silence slammed into the room, so heavy it physically pressed against the chest. The local Silverbridge elite, the senators, the judges, the banking executives who had just been laughing at my expense, visibly turned the color of fresh chalk. Every single person in that room who possessed a financial portfolio worth more than 7 figures knew exactly who had just walked through those doors. Nathaniel Cross was not just a billionaire venture capitalist. He was a financial grim reaper. He was the apex predator who systematically dismantled legacy empires for sport. More importantly, frantic rumors had been aggressively bleeding through the financial district for 6 months that Nathaniel was the anonymous shadow buyer, aggressively swallowing the Alvarado family's crippling debt. Carlos froze entirely. The horrific realization hit his nervous system like a freight train. His hand trembled so violently that the crumpled $50 bill he was offering me fluttered pathetically to the floor. A crystal glass of bourbon he had just retrieved from a passing tray slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the polished marble floor, exploding into 100 glittering shards, the amber liquid pooling like fresh blood around his expensive leather shoes. Survival instinct violently overrode his confusion. Carlos's eyes widened with a desperate, manic mix of terror and sudden, delusional hope. If the man who held his absolute financial execution order was standing in the very same room, this was his one, singular chance to grovel, to negotiate, to beg for a miraculous reprieve. He violently shoved past his own shocked relatives, nearly knocking his precious son Leo over in his frantic haste to intercept the Titan. Carlos pasted on a grotesquely wide, obsequious smile, extending both of his shaking hands outward in a gesture of pathetic submission. "Mr. Cross, what an absolute, profound honor to have you grace us with your presence today. I am—" Nathaniel did not even blink. He did not slow his powerful stride by a single fraction of a second. He glided past Carlos with the absolute, chilling indifference of a man walking past a rotting, insignificant piece of furniture. It was a snub so complete, so publicly devastating, that several people in the room actually winced and took a physical step backward. Nathaniel walked straight across the parlor, his dark, commanding eyes locked entirely on me, completely ignoring the hundreds of terrified faces burning into his profile. The severe, ruthless lines of his face softened into something entirely different the moment he stopped in front of me. He reached out, his large hands settling firmly and protectively around my waist, pulling me gently against his chest. He leaned down, a towering shield of absolute power, and pressed a long, tender kiss to my forehead. "I am so sorry, my darling," Nathaniel said, his rich, steady baritone easily carrying across the dead silence of the breathless room. The airspace over the coast was locked down for 2 hours because of a massive storm front. I told the pilots to push through the turbulence anyway. Are you all right? "I am perfectly fine now that you are here," I replied smoothly, resting my hand flat against the crisp lapel of his tailored suit. I slowly turned my head. Carlos was standing exactly where Nathaniel had left him, his outstretched hands still hovering awkwardly in the empty air. His face had slackened into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He looked like a man who had just watched his own executioner hand the firing squad their loaded rifles. The horrific math was finally clicking in his aging brain. If the penniless daughter he threw away was married to the Reaper, then the shadow buyer was not a random corporate raider. It was a highly targeted, personal execution. Leo was leaning against the far wall, his jaw completely unhinged, his eyes bulging as if he were witnessing a physical impossibility. The golden boy suddenly realized his father's wealth could no longer protect him. I let a perfectly calm, chillingly pleasant smile touch my lips as I looked at the man who had thrown me into a blizzard 17 years ago. As I was saying, "Father, I would love to formally introduce you to my husband, Nathaniel Cross." Carlos's brain violently rebooted. The sheer terror that had paralyzed his features a moment ago rapidly mutated into a grotesque, desperate simulation of familial joy. He actually let out a breathless, choked laugh, wiping a sudden bead of cold sweat from his forehead. In his mind, he had just been handed the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. He believed that blood, no matter how badly poisoned, was still a currency he could exploit. He took an eager step forward, practically vibrating with nervous energy, and thrust his right hand toward my husband. Ninaj. Nathaniel. My apologies. I was entirely taken by surprise. Carlos babbled, his voice pitched high and reedy, devoid of any of his usual commanding baritone. If I had known you were the one holding our corporate debt, I would have invited you to the estate ages ago. We are family. After all, a father-in-law and a son-in-law should not be fighting on the open market. We can sit down over a fine vintage scotch tonight, restructure this entire misunderstanding, and merge our interests. Nathaniel looked at Carlos's extended, trembling hand as if it were a venomous snake offering a handshake. He did not move a single muscle to reciprocate. He stood perfectly still, an immovable monument of dark authority, and allowed the agonizing silence to stretch for 10 excruciating seconds. Then, a sharp, cold smile curved the corner of Nathaniel's mouth. It was a smile completely devoid of mercy. You have severely misunderstood the situation, Carlos, Nathaniel said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that forced every single person in the massive parlor to hold their breath just to hear him. I am not the one buying your company. I have zero interest in your crumbling brick-and-mortar portfolio. I am just here to provide an armed escort for the actual buyer. Nathaniel took a deliberate step backward, smoothly yielding the center of the room, and placing me perfectly at the apex of the confrontation. Before Carlos could even process the gravity of those words, the lead attorney from the Wall Street delegation stepped forward. He unclasped a sleek leather portfolio and extracted a thick, heavily stamped legal document. With the precise, mechanical movements of an executioner handing over a death warrant, the lawyer pressed the heavy stack of papers directly into Carlos's chest, forcing the older man to grab it or let it fall. Notice of absolute foreclosure and complete asset acquisition, the attorney stated loudly, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Effective as of 8 o'clock this morning, every single subsidiary, every commercial property, the corporate headquarters, and the primary residential estate located right here in Silverbridge have been legally seized and transferred to the primary debt holder. Carlos stared at the front page, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text until they locked onto the bolded ink at the very bottom. His lips moved soundlessly as he read the name of the new, sole legal owner of the entire Alvarado empire. Mackenzie Alvarado, Chief Executive Officer, Nexus Core Analytics. The heavy document slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor with a dull, sickening thud. The physical color rapidly drained from Carlos's face, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to grab onto the edge of a nearby floral pedestal just to remain standing. The mighty real estate titan was completely, utterly broken. He realized, with crushing clarity, that he owned absolutely nothing: the mansion he slept in, the chairs his family sat on, the very ground he stood upon, now belonged exclusively to the 18-year-old girl he had thrown into the snow without a coat. Behind him, Leo let out a pathetic, high-pitched noise of sheer panic. Dad, do something. Tell them this is illegal. You cannot let her do this to us. Carlos could not even speak. His vocal cords were paralyzed by absolute suffocating ruin. I stepped forward, my designer heels clicking sharply against the floor, breaking the stunned silence of the terrified audience. I stopped mere inches from my father. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream or hurl petty insults. True power never requires a raised voice. I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out a worn, heavy paper envelope. It was sealed with old wax. I reached out and calmly tucked it into the breast pocket of Carlos's tailored suit. gently patting the fabric smooth. "That is from Grandmother Elena," I said softly, ensuring only he and Leo could hear my exact words. "She left it for me with her final instructions. It contains the original banking ledgers from 17 years ago, the ones proving Leo authorized every single fraudulent transfer, and the audio recording of you actively conspiring to cover it up and frame a minor. She kept it hidden all these years, knowing I would need a final nail for your coffin when I returned." Carlos gasped, his hands flying to his chest, clutching the envelope as if it were a live grenade. "Do not worry, Father," I whispered, my voice a soothing, lethal poison. "I am not sending the police to your door today. I want you to live in the absolute agony of poverty first. I want you to know exactly what it feels like to be completely erased." I turned my back on the wreckage of my former family. I did not spare a single glance for the whispering aunts, the trembling uncles, or the pathetic, whimpering brother who had just lost his stolen crown. I seamlessly linked my arm through Nathaniel's waiting arm. Together, we walked back down the long, opulent aisle of the funeral parlor, the crowd of elites actively parted for us, pressing their backs against the walls, terrified to even breathe in our direction. We walked out the heavy oak doors, leaving behind a completely demolished dynasty. A black armored sport utility vehicle was idling at the curb, ready to drive us directly to the private airstrip where our jet was waiting. I stepped into the warm leather interior, leaving the bitter, freezing air of Silverbridge behind me forever. The debt was paid in full, and the revenge was absolute, perfect, and magnificently elegant. Thank you so very much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below. If you found today's story engaging and want to help our team out, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity helps pay our hardworking staff, allows them to feed their families, and ensures we can keep creating these high-quality stories for you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.